Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great opportunity to be able to present some of my research to you and to have this conversation today. So I just wanted to thank the organizers for inviting me to join this conversation. So I'm going to start with a story. In October of 2008, on the heels of a generous monsoon that left upstate reservoirs brimming in Mumbai, the Municipal Corporation Standing Committee Chairman, Ravinder Vaikar, reportedly, according to Times of India, reportedly stormed out of a standing committee meeting in protest of continuing water shortages across the city. Quote, even posh buildings in the suburbs are not getting water, Vaikar fumed. Every time we complain, the municipal authorities have an excuse ready, end quote. So Vaikar's statement is striking. It's the dry taps in the city's upscale areas that have caught his attention and caused alarm. Shortage in popular neighborhoods might inspire outrage, but are certainly no surprise. And indeed, Mumbai's news media reports with almost numbing regularity on the water shortages afflicting the city's working classes. Mumbai politicians stage periodic marches and roadblocks and hunger strikes in demand of augmented supplies and additional distribution mains for their constituencies in the city's popular neighborhoods, areas that are generally characterized as so-called slums or informal areas, irrespective of the legal standings or planning histories of the city's highly differentiated working class housing stock. However much of an outrage, the notion that slum life is characterized by water shortage is hardly news, but how to understand dry taps in posh buildings. And for those of you that are looking at the image here, those rubber tubes or water pipes snaking over the open nala over to that neighborhood there. Sorry, there's a train going by, it might be loud. Vaikar's walkout gestures toward the two-part puzzle that animated the research for my book, Pipe Politics, Contested Waters, which is what I'm going to talk a bit about today. So the first part of this two-part puzzle that animated the project was that in Mumbai, 2 dazzling decades of urban development and roaring economic growth running up to the period of research had presided over the steady deterioration and sometimes the spectacular breakdown of the city's water infrastructures. As India's financial and commercial capital, Mumbai at the time of research accounted for over 6% of India's GDP, 75% of stock exchange activity, and over a third of the country's tax revenue. The city, in other words, suffered no dearth of financial resources with which it might redress infrastructural shortfalls. And indeed, municipal records suggested that a significant proportion of the city's water and sewerage budget regularly went unspent. And as for water, city engineers explained to me that there is no aggregate water shortage in Mumbai, where per capita availability, as well as estimated levels of leakage, is on par with that of London. So with no shortage of resources, either financial resources or hydraulic resources, how, I wondered, might Mumbai's fitful taps be made sense of? So the second puzzle that sort of drove my inquiry was that the conventional sort of available categories and concepts of analysis didn't get me very far in making sense of what I readily could see were geographies of access and inaccess in the city, which is to say water troubles clearly plagued not only the more than 60% of city residents reported to live in so-called slums, but city elites as well had seen their taps grow increasingly erratic and prone to drying up. Every day in Mumbai, as those of you who live there are well aware, hundreds of water tanker trucks drip their way along traffic-clogged streets, delivering water to both popular neighborhoods and upmarket hotels alike. And I like this slide in particular because I was in this tanker when it arrived in this particular neighborhood. And earlier that day, we had delivered with that same tanker a load of water to what might be described as a posh building in Vaikar's terms, a sort of high-end neighborhood. So same tanker, different neighborhoods. So all of which is to say, with the available analytical categories and explanatory frameworks unable to account for the puzzles that seem to be posed by Mumbai's water taps, I used a bit of a different research strategy. Ultimately, what I did was I explored this two-part puzzle over 18 months of ethnographic research in a geographically contiguous section of the city known as the M East Ward, which is that purple bit. M East is not only a political and an administrative district in Mumbai, but useful for my purposes, it's also a hydraulic unit, which is to say its neighborhoods, businesses, and industries are supplied water by gravity from a single local service reservoir, the Trombay High Level Reservoir. There is part of M East that is supplied by Trombay Low Level Reservoir, and I didn't do as much research there. So I was really interested in this hydraulic unit. So working with this hydraulic unit of analysis allowed me to explore spatial and hydraulic relations. So to ask things like, for instance, what is upstream or downstream from whom or what on any particular distribution main. So in this way, I was able to approach the book project not with a presumption of scarcity, that is the question of lack of access to water among pre-selected categories of user, rich or poor, formal or informal, citizen or slum dweller, these kinds of things. But rather, I was able to focus on how water is made to flow or how water is accessed without presuming in advance the explanatory power of these kinds of politically salient categories like class or community, rights or rules. And then one of the things that this methodological approach revealed, and which I'm going to talk a bit about today, is that well-to-do citizens, residents of so-called formal areas, globally connected elites encountered the very same hydropolitical and socio-material terrain as so-called slum dwellers or informal access or informal city dwellers in order to get water and negotiate the everyday risks of infrastructural breakdown. In the book itself, in the first half of the book, I sort of talk about how Mumbai's water pipes got to the place in which they are at the time of research, which is today the way in which the sort of project of remaking Mumbai into a so-called world-class city had a sort of particular and peculiar effect on water, the way in which water distribution planning was able to play out. But I'm gonna set that aside for now in the interest of time, and instead what I'm gonna do is share some ethnographic material from the book that demonstrates how in this context two very, very different neighborhoods get water. Many of you will probably recognize this image. This is the low-income municipal housing colony of Shivaji Nagar, Bangalore, which houses an estimated 7 lakh people in the marshlands of the city's, on the edge of the city's largest garbage dump. So in the decades leading up to the period of research, Shivaji Nagar, Bangalore had witnessed taps producing water at lower and lower pressures for shorter and shorter durations. So just a quick explanation, you can see these sort of vertical lines going up and down on this slide here. Each one of those is a lane. And so this road here is one of those lanes that goes north-south. Now there is a water distribution main underneath this road, but these skinny little pipes, they can't actually connect to that pipe in a way that would produce any water because the water pressure doesn't reach that far upstream. So what happens is that as taps go dry, families will pool their resources and pay to have their connections transferred further upstream on the distribution main. So that's what these little skinny pipes are doing. They're sort of traveling to points upstream on the pipe where they can find a pressurized spot on the below ground distribution main. We can talk later during the Q&A about what's happened in the interim period since I did this particular part of the research. The dynamics are still very much operative in the city more generally, but this particular neighborhood looks a bit different now. We can talk about that if anyone's interested. But what happens with these transfers is that families will pool their resources and then have the connection transferred further upstream on the distribution main, laying out the costs of piping and fitting themselves and then offsetting the expense by letting their neighbors use the tap for a fee. These connection transfers can happen in either of two ways. They can happen legally or they can happen illegally. The transfers can be done legally by paying a fee to a broker, someone who's generally referred to as a plumber, Someone who is familiar with precisely where on the underground distribution network water pressures might be better, and who then arranges with the water department for the transfer to the desired location, and also arranges for the transferred connection to be officially documented and followed up by regular and legitimizing bills. However, the fickleness and unpredictability of the water grid are such that many families will minimize their financial risk by opting for the illegal, undocumented, or illegal transfer, which is to say, even if a transfer is done legally, there's no guarantee that any new connection will produce water either now or in the future. So the broker negotiated payments for an undocumented connection would be less, but the family doesn't receive any documentation in the form of a regular bill. And this means that there is a risk that the undocumented transferred connection could be cut by the municipal authorities during any one of these sort of periodic raids on so-called unauthorized connections. So the constant transferring of connections, legally or illegally, documented, undocumented, formally or informally, we're talking about the informal city here, so I want to kind of push a little bit on these terms. The constant transferring of connections meant that it wouldn't be unusual for a 1-inch diameter pipe to travel overland for a quarter kilometer or more, traversing traffic intersections and weaving through open drains before finding a pressurized spot on the below ground distribution network. Owners of these long distance connections will thus face additional hazards, besides, as you can see, this pipe dipping precariously down into the open gutter, which is a hazard. So these are additional hazards like compromised water pressures from friction, the hazard of pipe theft, or of contamination producing and pressure reducing damage to the pipe that can result from exposure to traffic and to sewerage. So to address the first kind of problem of low pressure, connection owners install increasingly powerful suction pumps onto their drying up pipes, both motorized pumps and hand pumps like this one here. And with these pumps, they're attempting to suck with ever increasing strength a little more of the water in their direction. At the time of research, even the best placed connections in Shivajinagar, Banganwadi couldn't hope for water in the absence of strong pumps. The pumps, needless to say, were criminalized, thereby increasing the risk that even legally transferred connections, authorized connections, would be targeted by municipal authorities during periodic raids. And the local news media loved to report every few months that the local police station also had a suction pump on its own water connection, which everybody likes to sort of point out, and isn't this ironic? In any case, the tangles of 1-inch diameter pipes, a phenomenon that engineers refer to as spaghetti pipes for obvious reasons, are simultaneously productive of visibility and opacity. And these are dynamics that can either augment or minimize various kinds of risk. So on the one hand, the constant transferring of connections meant that there was no longer any correlation between the position of a house and the location on the grid of that house's municipal water connection. So just really quickly to explain this, again, this is our little grid of Shivajinagar, Banganwadi. This little next map is one that I made. And you can see that little block where that one square where there's those colorful blotches. There's 36 residences on that particular block. That's where I spent a good bit of time. And the blotchy colors are taps where you open them and hope that water comes out. So if I'm an engineer and I walk into this chawl and I want to know, is there water on this block? I haven't the slightest idea, because you can see that on this block there are 6 taps. 3 of them have, they produce water. 3 of these connections produce water, the blue ones. 2 of them don't produce any water, the red ones, and 1 of them sometimes produces water. So I'm a new engineer, I walk in, hey, does this block have water? No idea. And the reason I have no idea is because the knowledge that I don't have is the knowledge which is represented by the lines and the solid dots, which is where those connections are attached to the below ground distribution network. Now, I was able to make this map after months of sort of, gaining the trust and learning and begging for this sort of, in order to represent this mismatch in relationship between the kind of above ground landscapes of knowledge and below ground landscapes of knowledge. And so the question is, who has access to what kinds of knowledge? But we can see that this mismatch between the location of a house and the spot where that house's connection is joined to the network would make it exceedingly difficult for water department engineers to assess and manage water pressure at various points around the neighborhood. But at the same time, the spaghetti pipes make it hard for municipal authorities to pinpoint exactly which pipe is connected to which house. And this provides a measure of protection to households whose connection transfers might have been undocumented. Individual households, however, generally know precisely which pipe is theirs, and they can generally track the path that the pipe follows to the place where it's connected onto the distribution network. So what happens is when a tap would stop producing water, a connection owner would walk the length of his or her connection, and he knows which is his because he was there when the connection was made. And the stakes of this knowledge are quite high. So he knows exactly, you can see these pipes kind of disappear into a pile, and when they come back out, it's unclear which one belongs to which. So what they would do is they would walk the length of the connection to see if their pipes had been stolen, since of course steel piping has a high resale value, as well as whether their connection had been stolen, which is to say whether the connection had been cut off at the source and then affixed to some other pipe, which then is diverted to some other and now undecipherable endpoint. And this phenomenon of sort of stolen connections is not uncommon, not only in Shivajinagar Banganwadi, but in any Mumbai neighborhood where this spaghetti pipe phenomenon prevails. So to lessen the risk of theft, either of pipes or connections, the owner of any new or transferred connection will generally make payments not only to the plumber or broker who negotiates the details of the transfer with the water department, but will also make payments to a local person whose residence or office is near enough to the connection point on the water distribution main that he or his friends can monitor the comings and goings in the area. So for instance, this fellow here, he happens to live at the intersection of a sort of highly pressurized spot. And so he spends much of his time sort of sitting there monitoring the comings and goings. So if anybody's, cutting connections or doing anything, he would have seen it. So he's somebody who has this very important kind of information. So my research found, this was, 10 years ago. My research found
we are about 20 minutes into the session, about 18, 19 minutes. So if you want to just wrap up, we are at about 5:20. So if you want to wrap up in a few minutes and maybe create some dialogue, that will be great. Yeah.
That sounds fine.
Already.
Yeah, so let me just get to the sort of stakes of this kind of knowledge. The point that this all sort of adds up to is that this kind of knowledge becomes incredibly valuable, not only for getting water, but also for political purposes. So in 2007, for instance, a neighborhood very close to Shivajinagar Banganwadi kicked out their incumbent, 2-decade-long incumbent municipal corporator who was a major Congress Party candidate, and instead elected their local valve operator to represent them in the municipal corporation. Now, this fellow campaigned on a promise and a demonstrated promise that he was able to sort of command this kind of research or this kind of knowledge to all kinds of ends. And he won by a comfortable margin. And over the next 5 years, when he was a corporator, he knows things like how do you write into the G budget, the water and sewerage budget, provision for below ground distribution mains. So he was able to use his position in the municipal corporation, not to do some sort of, clientelistic patronage politics, but rather in order to use the resources of the municipal corporation to make sort of material investments in the landscape. So for instance, we saw the inauguration of a new health dispensary, a new below ground distribution main, a slew of above ground meters, metered water connections that were productive. They were able to combat the long-standing battle with tuberculosis and other kinds of pathologies, which in the context of COVID is a really important thing to pay attention to. What kinds of interventions, urban interventions, developmental interventions are being operationalized in what name? So rather than sort of seeing the demolition of the neighborhood through some sort of slum rehabilitation project where residents are stacked one on top of another that earn lucrative development rights for a builder, rather we're seeing the revitalization of the neighborhood, its infrastructures, and of public life and health. So the point that I want to make is that it's this kind of knowledge that can, in fact, empower creative forms of urban infrastructural development and intervention. And that I think as people who are really concerned with thinking creatively, it's important to involve these other forms of expertise in the way in which we think about framing, the way in which urban problems are being framed, and therefore solutions or sort of creative interventions can be imagined or empowered. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for your patience and apologies for going over. I can talk about water all day. Anyone who's interested in the book, I'm happy to provide a PDF of it if they want to email me.
Lisa, thank you so much for that. This was an absolutely fascinating talk. And I think the anecdote that you ended with is actually a really interesting one, because I think it builds on sort of a couple of themes that I wanted to ask you a little bit about. So I think, first of all, the notion of an intermediary almost, right? So someone who sits between the communities and the government, because the government in this instance seems fairly distant, doesn't seem to really know what might actually be going on the ground. So did you actually in your research see almost local informal leaders come up who could actually help provide the intermediation that might have been needed between communities and the government to help deliver services better? Is that a phenomenon that you noticed, and how did that actually work in terms of sort of power structures and so on?
Yeah, it's such a, thank you for this question. Or for inviting me to talk about it, because it's something that I've been working on extensively. One way, when I began this study, I sort of thought about it almost in the way you've just described, in a spatialized way, where you've got, the community sort of over here and the state over here, and then what's in the middle that enables good or bad things or communication to happen. And what I've learned over the course of sort of tracking very carefully these kinds of dynamics is that spatialization is really dynamic, and also I think is changing and has changed. I began this project in 2008, and it's very different even now than it was. So it's not so much what I've learned, again, just to talk about this fellow who I'm calling Sable, it's the kind of knowledge which is the kind of expertise, I'll call it, which enables certain kinds of really interesting interventions that voters and community actors are interested in empowering. So what we're seeing more and more is that people who are able to garner this kind of very, very local and very powerful knowledge, where is, like the knowledge of the chaviwalas, of the valve operators is a great example. This fellow who I talked about, his father was a valve operator, his grandfather was a valve operator. Neither of them were ever elected to the municipal corporation, right? So the question is, why is it right now that this person is able to parlay this kind of expertise into a successful bid, a sweep of his district election? And it's not just him. I mean, if we look across the city, we can see that all kinds of different forms of knowledge are being empowered. And what we see now is that the parties at election time, and I'm talking about the municipal elections because that's mostly what I've researched, during the period running up to the election, the 3-week period running up to the election, is this elaborate game of trying to corral all of the local experts whose knowledge voters trust to the moon and back, because this is the kind of knowledge that is very high stakes for people. Who can, help you get a ration card? Who can make your water run? And it's these kinds of people that the parties have realized command the loyalty and trust of people, not for any kind of, ideological reason, but because people are very good at knowing who has the expertise to help them. And so what we're seeing is, I think, a much more competitive kind of electoral landscape where voters are very, very savvy. And sometimes, I get asked by my friends, colleagues who work in other cities, why don't we see this kind of thing, in other cities? Like, why are you so optimistic about democracy in Mumbai? And I say, I'm not exactly sure, but Mumbai voters, they can sniff out, expertise, like in the right kind of expertise, in a way that I find inspiring. I wish that American voters were so engaged.
No, that's great. Very helpful. You also talk about the sort of the below ground network of knowledge. And one of the questions that's coming in is just, are there ways to actually document some of this knowledge, to almost formalize it a little bit? Because it does speak to maybe the state's capacity as well to understand what these issues are and therefore address them, right? So did you see ways of actually documenting and formalizing that knowledge?
So, I mean, this is a really long story that I have written about. So the first chapter of the book is about this sort of unmapping, the unintentional unmapping of the water distribution network that happened beginning from the 1980s. And that was in the context of widespread discussions about involvement of private sector actors in municipal distribution. To make a very interesting and fascinating story that I encourage everybody to read, it's also kind of a tragic comedy, very short. While everybody was sort of waiting for privatization to happen, there was a hiring freeze because they didn't want to keep hiring people if you were going to, go private, as it were. So during the sort of 2-decade-long waiting period, the municipal staff shrunk considerably, such that people were allocated constantly into sort of more immediate functions, and some of the sort of very, very important but less immediate functions, like, say, mapping or like keeping up with interventions. So what we see over 20 years is the dramatic expansion of the city, right? Like the extension of the suburbs, the extension of the distribution network, without any staff to actually do this work of documentation. So what happened was that this knowledge, which used to be very meticulously, kept up with, it began to live in the minds of local staff people at the local level. So people like the valve operator, again, became the sort of location of this knowledge. And we've got all of these sort of stories in the water department about, engineers phoning up retired chaviwalas to ask them if they can help find a pipe, because they need to access something and it's it hasn't been marked. So these kinds of things, which I write about in the book. So more recently, there has been an effort to sort of reinstitutionalize some of this knowledge in order to kind of remap and then do hydraulics again, as it were, because this has made it very difficult to sort of do hydraulic engineering. And the water department has hired different kinds of consultants. There was a French consultancy that was working for the city for a while, and I had a really interesting conversation with some engineers and experts, and they said, how furious they always were whenever they heard somebody, a Mumbaikar, speaking badly about the water department, because they said, the size of the distribution network, the amount of water that this department is dealing with, and under the conditions that it's profound what they're able to accomplish every day. So, for instance, a city like New York loses an estimated 40% of water in their distribution network. Mumbai loses apparently a bit, although I'm not exactly sure how they calculate such things, but this French engineer was saying they lose significantly less than that. And it's because of the peopling of the infrastructure, the sort of dense ecologies of expertise and very local knowledge. So the project was to try and get these sort of dispersed forms of expertise and knowledge sort of back into the hands of the planners. And that project is underway at present, I think. I think it's still going on.
Got it. No, that's fascinating. Thanks so much, Lisa. I think we have, we're probably coming up on time, but I'll just take one other quick question. Professor Amitabh Kundu is on as well, and I think he wanted to seek a clarification from you. So Amitabh, if you just want to go ahead and ask your question.
I must tell you that this is one of the very exhaustive study based on the understanding and also field data at the ground level. And also it brings in the political economy at the city level. to explain the spatial variations. The point that strikes me, if you compare using the secondary data from population census and NSS, well, for city level data from NSS is difficult to get, but we have percentage of households not having toilets, which is twice as high in Mumbai compared to the urban average. I can give you the figure. 18% of the households do not have toilet in urban India, and 41% for Greater Mumbai Municipal Corporation. Similarly, if you take percentage of households living in one-room unit, it's almost double in Maharashtra, in Mumbai. But as far as water is concerned, the secondary data shows that only 21% households do not have access to water within the premises, against 33%, which is much higher. So I was just wondering the discrepancy between water and sanitation. Is it that illegal connections are there at the household level? Because the NSS and census would only give you whether you have a connection. It's legal or illegal, it doesn't matter. Or the quality of water that is being provided and the quantum of water. Is that the major problem and not just the connection? As I said, that the toilet situation in Maharashtra and also in Mumbai is alarming. And that's what explains the incidence of this, COVID-19 in a major way in these slums. I just wanted to know whether you can give some explanation for this.
I mean, thank you for that question. And what your question raises for me are sort of two things. One is, like, what do we do with the data and like numbers, these kinds of statistics? And particularly in light of the research that I've done, what I've learned is that it's incredibly complicated to sort of have a general category of sort of access to water in the house, because what that actually means is incredibly complicated in practice. Does that mean that you've got a tap? If so, does that mean that there pressure in your tap? When is there pressure in your tap? Does that mean that you have access to somebody else's tap? So for instance, with these transferred connections, you might have one connection which comes out outside somebody's house, and then you can prepay by the month for 5 minutes of use of water time during the 2-hour amount of time of that person's tap. And then what you've got a rubber hose that then you go during your 5 minutes and you stick your rubber hose on the end of that tap and you bring it into your kitchen, your one room, and then you fill your vessels. Now, when somebody is saying that they have water access in their home, does that count? Like, is that a community standpoint post, or does that extra bit of rubber pipe mean that it's in the house? So I guess all of which is to say, I'm not exactly sure what that number means, and it could mean a million things. The other thing is that, I had this lovely conversation with an engineer that I talk about in the book, where he said something to the effect of, he was talking about how he knows whether some valve has been operated outside of sort of formal valve operations, like whether somebody's figured out how to open a valve or close a valve in the neighborhood in order to augment sort of water pressure. And I said, well, how can you know? And he said, well, it's my job to know. And I said, well, what does that mean? And he said, well, I go there and I ask them, did you get any water? And nobody will ever say they got water. Nobody will ever say they got water. But you can tell by the extent of their complaining relative to last week whether the valve has been manipulated. So all of which is to say, when we approach a neighborhood or a community that has struggles of access to resources, and we ask them about their access, they're always trying to interpret what we're up to in asking them that question. And so, the answers that I get when I ask people things are much more reflective of what they think I'm up to than what may or may not come out of their pipe. So I'm not entirely sure what the context was of that survey, right? So people will say, you start going door to door and asking people things, they think that the slum demolition, crew is behind you if you start surveying, this kind of thing. But the question you raise about sanitation from the perspective of somebody who looks at very, very dense kinds of urban morphologies, my sort of, out of the blue instinct would just be that, like, toilets take up a lot of space. So people are probably less prone to, if they do have access to a community toilet up the block, particularly if they don't have a whole lot of access to water. So to have a toilet in your house, you only want
Lisa,
that. Oh, really
Lisa,
quickly.
sorry. Yeah, many apologies, but yeah, if you could just
really quick. You
Sure.
only want a toilet in your house if you've got enough water to make that smell go away. Otherwise, you don't want it there. You want to walk up the block where it's going to stink somewhere else. So you can't really separate those two either. So space and smell is that's my hunch. But it's a great question.
Perfect. Lisa, well, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there. I know we could continue this conversation, but thank you so much for your time. This was a real pleasure.
Take care. Thanks again.